only kept the strange heads in their home, but paranormal activity soon occurred. The heads would turn in the night to look in a different direction, and objects would be thrown across the room. The family living next door also reported strange paranormal activity. Mrs. Nellie Dodds reported a strange half-sheep, half-man creature that entered her home and touched her leg. Her son also reported his hair being pulled by an unseen hand. The heads were sent to experts, in part to figure out what they were, and in part to stop the paranormal activity. The paranormal activity did stop, but figuring out what they were wasn't so easy. Experts disagreed on whether these were actually ancient artifacts or modern-day forgeries. Some believe the heads were made from sandstone, others believe it was an artificial cement. It wasn't even clear if the faces had been carved or if they'd been created using a kind of mold. One respected researcher who believed they were legitimate was Dr. Ann Ross. Dr. Ross specialized in work on Celtic history and had a particular interest in what she called head cults and the apparent worship of objects shaped like heads. She found similarities in the art styles between the Hexam heads and artifacts known to be of an ancient Celtic origin, and claimed that the Hexam heads were from the Iron Age. She said the Robson family garden may have once been a shrine. Dr. Ross also backed up the paranormal claims. She had taken the Hexam heads to her home to be part of her Celtic heads collection, and the paranormal activity followed her there. As well as poltergeist activity and shadow creatures, she allegedly woke one night to a half-wolf, half-man creature. She followed it out of her room and into her kitchen, where it disappeared. Her daughter also witnessed a similar creature. A possible explanation came when a local man claimed that he had made the heads as toys while living in the same house as the Robsons a few years before they moved in, but his creations didn't match the authentic heads. The Hexam heads were moved to Southampton University before being handed over to another researcher who apparently lost them. The current location of the Hexam heads is as much of a mystery as their origin. Number 4. In 2015, the strange story of a haunted shop ledger made the news in England. Not only was it 100 years old, it had been hidden behind a wall and apparently had a number of entities attached to it. The ledger was found in 1988 by Tony Beniovitz. 4 years earlier, the Shoreland Fuchs jewelry store in Brighton had closed down, and now Tony was working on the demolition. When one of the interior walls was knocked down, Tony discovered something strange inside. It was an old leather-bound ledger which dated back to 1915. Tony had no idea what the ledger was doing bricked up behind a wall, but decided to take it back home. The ledger itself was relatively ordinary, though interesting given its history. Some of the entries were illegible, while others seemed to include mysterious items that couldn't be explained. Most were simply jewelry or furniture from a shop decades ago. But almost as soon as it entered the Beniovitz home, the paranormal activity started. Disembodied voices whispering, unexplained sounds, and strange marks and rugs were among the haunting experiences. The activity focused on Tony's daughter, Josephine, who claimed to see full-body apparitions. These apparitions were of men, women, and children, all seemingly attached to the ledger. The strangest of the apparitions was a soldier on a war horse. There was no explanation for any of the spirits within the ledger, but these could at least explain why it had been bricked up all those years earlier. Over the years, the apparitions became stronger and stronger, to the point where Tony was able to see them too. Eventually, one of the apparitions spoke to Josephine, telling her that the ledger had to be returned to Brighton for the 100th anniversary of its first entry. By this point, Josephine had moved to Maidstone, Kent, but was keen to get the ledger back to Brighton. She contacted Preston Manor, a Brighton museum that itself has a long history of hauntings, with dozens of spirits ranging from benevolent to extremely dark. At first, the museum was reluctant to take the ledger, but according to a museum worker, decided to take it after hearing how scared Josephine was of this upcoming deadline. A medium who was at the museum for another event came across the old book and said that it had bad things emanating from it. The anniversary of the ledger's first record came and went without any issue, and it seems the spirits are now at peace, or they may have merged with the dozens of other spirits that call Preston Manor home. Number 3. In the 1960s, a block of student apartments was built at Queen's University in Belfast. Allenbrook Hall would become the site of a violent haunting that seemingly didn't stop until it was demolished in 2004. Room 611 in particular seemed to be the home of something violent and menacing. A student named Ken told his story on a BBC podcast. In 1981, Ken was studying microbiology at the university and had the misfortune of staying in room 611. He recounted one night waking up to see a shadow figure standing beside the desk on the opposite side of the room. It was darker than anything Ken had seen before and seemed evil. It began moving towards him, but when Ken launched at it, it disappeared. The room at the time was home to 2 students, so Ken woke up his roommate. His roommate described something similar. While he was sleeping, he could see a bright white light, which eventually turned into a man's head. The head turned towards him, showing the face of a man their age who glared at him. Other students who stayed in that room had similar stories of a shadowy figure appearing at night. Even the cleaner who worked at Allenbrook said that she didn't like to go into that room and felt as if something was in there with her. The figure made its presence known in other ways. Books and cutlery would move by themselves. Doors would be pounded against, only for nobody to be on the other side, and unexplained footsteps could be heard. A caretaker described living in the building alone when all the students had gone home, but still feeling the presence. It would call the elevator with nobody else in the building, turn lights on and off, and on one occasion, all the electronics in the caretaker's apartment surged. When the electrician was called, he found no cause for the surge. In 2004, the block was knocked down to make way for new buildings, and it seems the entity went along with the old Allenbrook building. Number 2. The famous Lombard Street in San Francisco may be mostly known for its tight hairpin turns, but it's also home to a terrifying haunted apartment and a dark paranormal story. The paranormal case began in 1967, when 1000 Lombard Street was occupied by a woman named Patricia Montandon. Despite coming from a working-class background, Patricia was known as a socialite in San Francisco. She made a name for herself as a friend of the famous, hosting extravagant dinner parties and writing a column for the local newspaper. She was well known in San Francisco, even if her fame didn't expand elsewhere. Her reputation as a party hostess earned her a book deal. She was to write about the art of parties and decided to host another as a research exercise for her book. The theme was to be astrology and the occult, which was very much in fashion at the time. Palm readers, crystal ball readers, and other occult professionals were invited to entertain guests at a luncheon. One of these professionals was a tarot reader, who arrived late with an uninvited entourage. He asked Patricia for a drink, but she became distracted before she could get him one. The tarot reader was supposedly so outraged by this that he cursed both Patricia and her home, and stormed out with his entourage. From that day, a series of strange events began to occur at the home. It was cold no matter how high the thermostat was set. Patricia's dog would wake at 2 a.m. every night to bark at nothing, and both Patricia and her friend Mary Louise Ward felt there was another presence in the home. Patricia was also the target of non-paranormal attacks, including a burglary, attempted kidnapping, and harassment. By this point, Patricia was a wreck, and she eventually moved out of Lombard Street, but the apartment's haunting wouldn't stop. An unexplained fire would take place just a week or so after Patricia moved out. The same night, Mary Louise lost her light, though the cause of her passing was never determined. Even after the fire, a medium taking photos of the apartment claimed to have captured a spirit in the negatives and warned Patricia to never return. Patricia's fortune eventually turned around, and it would appear the Lombard Street mansion is no longer haunted, but the previous paranormal experiences remain unexplained. Number 1. Blackfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh is known for its ghostly dog and famous graves, but there's one ghost in the graveyard that is less than friendly. The Mackenzie poltergeist is believed to be the spirit of George Mackenzie, a ruthless prosecutor from the 17th century. His ghost is just as violent as Mackenzie was in life. Mackenzie was made Lord Advocate in 1677 during the reign of Charles II. The king had recently ordered a new Bible to be used, and the punishment for continuing the old practices were harsh. Mackenzie happily enacted the king's will, imprisoning hundreds of rebelling Covenanters in a field beside the kirkyard. They were made to stay outside for months before being put on trial, which most did not survive. Mackenzie himself passed away in 1691 and was entombed in the Black Mausoleum in the kirkyard, a mausoleum that held many of his relatives. For 300 years, there was little disturbance, but in 1999, Mackenzie's spirit was allegedly released. The homeless in Edinburgh will sometimes come to the graveyard, seeking shelter at night. It was supposedly a stormy night when one such homeless man broke into the Black Mausoleum for shelter. The story goes that a hole opened up beneath him, exposing a Plague-era grave, and he was forced to climb out and run from the area. The hole is still visible today. Since that day, the paranormal activity around the mausoleum has been high. The Mackenzie poltergeist has been described as the most active poltergeist in the world. Shortly after the tomb was opened, visitors to the churchyard reported a rush of cold air coming from the tomb. Not long after, a woman was found near the mausoleum, unconscious with bruises on her neck. The site continues to be a stop on ghost tours, though the mausoleum is no longer accessible to the general public. Tour group members have reported unexplained scratches, bruises, and other wounds and fatigue. Some